Norway 1718. Charles XII leads 40,000 men into Norway to seize the capital. At Fredrikshald, fate intervenes. The king is killed. Far to the north, a second Swedish force hears the news. Stranded, starving, and freezing, they gather in the village church, singing for salvation. Their only path home lies across deadly, snow-covered mountains. Under fair conditions, the crossing would challenge even the strongest. Few will survive the march. For these men, it will be the last trial of a dying empire. A journey few will survive. In December 1715, King Charles XII set foot on the Swedish mainland. After 15 years of war, the once mighty Swedish army had been decimated. Gone was the great power of Sweden and the prestige that came with such an empire. The Baltic provinces were now occupied by Russia, as was Finland. The northern German territories were under occupation by Danish and Prussian forces. But it wasn't only the Swedish army that had been severely weakened during these years of conflict. The Swedish people had also endured much. The plague had ravaged the land during the king's absence, claiming many lives. Years of famine and poor harvests had also taken a heavy toll on the population. This was the dire situation in which King Charles found himself. Once again, enemies stood at Sweden's borders, just as they had in year 1700. Sweden was at war with Russia, England, Hanover, Denmark, Prussia, and Saxony-Poland. An invasion of Sweden was imminent, yet the king was not ready to negotiate peace. It would be too costly, with large territorial losses. It was crucial for Sweden to create room for negotiation, and this would be done through an attack on Denmark. There were many reasons why Denmark was the target. One key factor was that the Danish fleet had effectively trapped the Swedish navy, rendering it useless in the war. If Denmark were forced to peace, then the Swedish army would have a better chance of reclaiming lost territories around the Baltic Sea. King Charles sought to exploit the fact that the Danish army was spread thin. The winter of 1715 to 1716 was harsh and unforgiving. An ice sheet formed over the waters of Öresund. It was the perfect opportunity to surprise the enemy. Swedish soldiers would march across the frozen strait and capture Copenhagen, but this plan was thwarted by a storm that shattered the ice. King Charles then decided to invade Norway. This was no coincidence. Norway was an important economic asset for the Danes. If Sweden could conquer and control Norway, it would deal a significant blow to Denmark. In February 1716, the first invasion of Norway took place. The primary goal was to capture Christiania. The strategy was for the king, starting from Värmland, to invade via Lillestrøm. With a force of around 3,000 men, another large force would arrive at Christiania via Fredrikstad. Additionally, a smaller force would invade the Trondheim area to prevent Danish-Norwegian reinforcements from arriving from the north. The invasion ended in a resounding defeat. Although the Swedish forces managed to occupy Christiania, they failed to take Åkershus fortress, which, in practical terms, meant they had no control over the city. The king and his army were forced to retreat south and regroup. For weeks, the army remained idle, until the king decided, in a final attempt to salvage the invasion, to capture Fredrikshald fortress. The Swedes suffered heavy losses but managed to take Fredrikstad, though not the fortress itself. The final blow came in June 1716. A Danish-Norwegian fleet led by the legendary sea captain Peter Vessel Tordenskjöld succeeded in annihilating the Swedish merchant fleet at Dynekilen, which was about to deliver the materials the king needed to conquer Norway. This was not the first time Tordenskjöld had made life difficult for the Swedes. and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The army in the north around Trondheim also failed in its mission. In June 1716, the Swedes were forced to retreat. The first Norwegian invasion had ended in a crushing setback for King Charles XII. The king made Lund his headquarters and immediately began planning another attack on Norway. This time, the Swedes would be better prepared. The king planned the invasion down to the smallest detail, but there was a problem. The king needed money and a new army. In addition to this, an imminent threat of invasion loomed. The Allied forces had grown in number, and the enemies were assembling into an overwhelming force. By the fall of 1716, things were looking grim for the Swedes. Denmark and Russia had gathered a force of 70,000 men to invade southern Sweden. On the Baltic Sea, the Danish, Norwegian, Russian, and British fleets were ready to carry out the operation. However, the king had managed to acquire a formidable advisor in Georg Heinrich von Goetz. The king placed great trust in Goetz, who acted as a foreign minister, managing diplomacy as well as overseeing the economy. When it came to foreign policy, the Swedes were playing a dangerous game. Signs of friction among the allies were becoming increasingly evident. The Russians were growing increasingly irritated with the delays of the other nations in fulfilling their promises. This was something that the Swedes, particularly Goetz, managed to exploit. By establishing contact with countries within the alliance and initiating discussions about separate peace treaties, the friction between the allies deepened. Through his diplomacy, Goetz bought time, delaying the impending invasion. Goetz also managed, through shrewd economic measures, to secure the funds necessary to raise a new army, including through the famous emergency coins. In the spring of 1718, plans for the second campaign against Norway were finalized. This would become one of the largest military operations in Swedish history. Unlike the first attempt in 1716, which had failed despite ambitious goals, this time a significantly larger army would be involved. Under the leadership of Charles XII, 40,000 soldiers would march from Bohuslän, capture the fortress of Fredrikshald, and then advance towards Christiania. Meanwhile, another 10,000 men under General Armfeldts' command would be mobilized from Jämtland to strike at Trondheim and its surroundings. Armfeldts' forces were primarily composed of Finnish veterans, soldiers hardened by years of warfare, as well as newly recruited Swedish troops, many of whom had no prior combat experience. Despite this difference, Armfeldt reported to Charles XII that his army was well trained and ready. Armfeldt's mission, though smaller in scale than the main armies, was no easy task. The king had planned for 6 weeks to be sufficient for Armfeldt to capture Trondheim. Armfeldt faced two major challenges: supply issues and the difficult terrain. Charles XII had learned much from his previous campaign in Norway and understood that logistics would be crucial for success. To ensure the army could be supplied, he ordered the construction of large supply depots along the border. This would reduce the need for plundering and protect both the Norwegian and Swedish civilian populations from further suffering. Armfeldt worked closely with Johan Henrik Frisenheim of the War Council to address all the challenges the king's invasion required. In 1717, Armfeldt and Frisenheim traveled up the border with Norway to determine the best place for the army to march from. They concluded that Duved in Jämtland was the optimal location, as it was relatively close to the border, under 50 miles away. They received the king's approval and soon began constructing a supply depot in Duved, which would become the Northern Army's main supply point. The focus on supplies for the Northern invasion was no coincidence. It was critical to provide for an army that would be marching further and further from the border. Charles XII had decided to launch the invasion in late autumn, which would carry on into the winter. This created significant problems for Armfeldt and Frisenheim. It was customary for armies to supply themselves from the area which they were stationed. as carrying large quantities of provisions was impractical. There would be less access to food along the way, meaning it was necessary for the army to carry its own provisions and for supplies to be stockpiled in Duved to sustain the army over a longer period. The king's decision to launch the invasion later in the year had multiple reasons. One was that the enemy fleets would not be able to maneuver as easily in the winter as they could in the summer, which would benefit Sweden's military goals. Another reason was the terrain. The mountainous landscape posed a significant challenge for large armies. In the summer, the roads and paths were muddy and nearly impassable, but in late autumn, the frozen ground made it easier to transport soldiers and supplies. The hope was to complete the invasion within 6 weeks, before the snow arrived and made supply transport more difficult. The king aimed to capture Trondheim, to set up winter quarters on the Norwegian side and then receive supplies via sled from Sweden. This required an enormous amount of food. It fell to Frisenheim to address the supply and provisioning challenges. His task proved to be extremely difficult. Calculations showed that each soldier needed vast quantities of food and supplies each month. 17 kilos of bread, 5.2 liters of peas, 8.5 kilograms of meat, 20 grams of salt, and 10 grams of tobacco. Additionally, thousands of slaughter animals and transport animals were required to meet the army's needs. However, without wagons to transport supplies, soldiers, aided by horses, had to carry all the food, along with fodder for the animals, as well as weapons and artillery. Frisenheim calculated that a total of 7,000 horses would be required for the campaign. Special saddlebags and baskets were designed to carry everything necessary. Farmers across much of Sweden were forced to provide animals. Their draft horses and livestock were seized. The already depleted provinces of Norrland and Jämtland were forced to contribute grain, animals, and transport means, causing great hardship for the local population. Frisenheim and Governor Hugo Hamilton warned the king about the situation's severity and reported on the suffering caused by these measures. Hamilton even sent a sample of the substandard bread the farmers were forced to eat to illustrate the extent of the hardship. The king reacted swiftly and ordered grain and seed to be distributed from military reserves to ease the crisis. However, this came at a cost. The farmers would have to repay it at harvest time. In the summer of 1718, Armfeldts army began its march to Duved. The army consisted of about 10,000 men, including 7,000 infantry and 2,300 cavalry. The soldiers were evenly split between Swedish and Finnish troops. Despite lacking resources and facing logistical difficulties, each soldier carried provisions for 6 weeks, amounting to about 65 kilograms per person, along with personal belongings. The uniforms, often blue and yellow, were complemented by headgear, either triangular hats or karpus, the latter more suited to the Nordic climate. In Duved, Armfeldt and Frisenheim prepared their forces for the march across the border. The soldiers had hoped the king would come to Duved to motivate and inspire them, but to their disappointment, he did not appear. Armfeldt had received orders for the army to march on August 4th, 1718. For many, this order must have seemed impossible, as a large number of horses necessary to transport all the supplies were still lacking. Despite the king's insistence that Armfeldt's army begin the march on August 4th, it did not happen. It wasn't until August 18th that the main body of the army began its march towards the Norwegian border. A smaller force had already left on August 9th to prepare and improve the roads leading to the border. The soldiers were meant to carry provisions for 6 weeks, but due to the delay in the march, they began consuming their field rations. By now, only enough provision for 4 weeks remained. It took time to replenish the supplies, and it would be some time before the provision would reach the army. By the time the soldiers set off to the Norwegian border, they had enough food to last about 30 days. On August the 26th, the Swedes marched from Skalstugan to the border. They were not unobserved. Norwegian scout units kept the Swedish army under surveillance. The Norwegian General Major Vincent Budde was responsible for the defense of northern Norway. At the border, Budde had stationed a force of 4,000 men, spread over a long distance, covering more than 200 kilometers. Bode did not know from where the Swedes would invade. Armfeldt had decided to take the route towards Stene Redoubt. It was crucial to secure and control the road to Sweden, which would facilitate the supply of provisions. Therefore, taking the stronghold was of utmost importance. Bode had built up the defenses well along the route to Stene Redoubt. The Norwegians had constructed simple fortifications and felled trees to hinder the Swedish advance. The Swedes could likely break through this defense, but it would take time, and time was something the Swedes didn't have. The amount of provisions was decreasing day by day. Armfeldt then chose an alternative route. His plan was to bypass Stene Redoubt and attack where the Danes and Norwegians did not expect. Bode and the Norwegians had not anticipated that the Swedes would dare to march through rugged, roadless terrain with steep mountain slopes. The Swedish army set up camp at Lake Färö and rested there for a day. They then marched over the mountain and onward to Lake Gröningen. Exhausting marches the Swedes undertook were through steep mountainous terrain, where they often had to build causeways to make the passage easier. Up and down the mountains the army went, and it took its toll. Armfeldt sent letters back to Frisenheim, fearing that the provisions were already running out too quickly. After all the hardships, the weary Swedish army was now about a mile away from Stene Redoubt. They had stopped here to rest. The following day, under the cover of darkness, a smaller force began to move around in an attempt to encircle the stronghold. The redoubt was teeming with activity. General Bode and his closest men discussed the latest threat. Reports of Swedish movements were discussed in detail. Scouts had observed a Swedish force nearby, and the threat to their positions was tangible. Bode expressed his determination. "We will not abandon a single post unless the enemy drive us from it." The words were strong, but the pressure on the Norwegian forces was palpable. At the same time, 200 Swedish riders moved through Tromsdalen. The terrain was difficult, and the march took several hours. By noon, they reached the bridge at the river, only 100 meters from the Norwegian redoubt. A Norwegian company tried to destroy the bridge to slow the advance, but the Swedes managed to cross and continue forward. When the sound of gunfire echoed over the area, Bode realized his position was threatened from several directions. Scout reports confirmed that the Swedes had crossed the river and were approaching from the rear. To avoid being encircled, he ordered a retreat to Trondheim, while dragoons were sent to delay the enemy at Levringfarm. At Levringfarm, the Norwegian dragoons met the Swedish cavalry in a short but intense battle. Despite fierce resistance, the Swedes broke through, forcing the Norwegian forces to fall back. As the Swedish advanced, they encountered Norwegian infantry positioned to defend the farm. Hardened by previous battles, the infantry fired coordinated musket volleys, temporarily halting the Swedes and inflicting losses on both sides. When the fighting subsided, the field lay silent, filled with the dead and wounded. Stene Redoubt fell with little resistance. Despite Bode's promise to withstand the enemy, the Norwegian forces fell back, unable to match the Swedes' experience and organization. With control over Stene Redoubt, the Swedes opened the way for new operations in Trondheim. On September 3rd, 1718, under General Armfeldts' command, the Swedish army marched towards the strategically important Skåne Redoubt at Trondheim Fjord. For the Swedish forces, it was a key point in the plan to crush Norwegian resistance. Skåne Redoubt, perched on a high point with a view over the fjord, had long been a symbol of the Norwegian defense. However, in recent years, its capabilities had weakened. The commandant was elderly, and his troops largely consisted of young recruits, while the few cannons they had would hardly withstand a serious assault. As the Swedes approached the fort's defense, the commandant realized there was no chance of resisting a Swedish attack. After a few cannon shots, a delegation was sent to negotiate surrender. Shortly thereafter, it was decided that the redoubt would be handed over without resistance. The Norwegians marched away without a single bullet being fired. For the Swedish army, this was an important step towards their goal. The success at Skåne Redoubt solidified Armfeldts position and gave the Swedish troops an advantage. It was an unexpectedly easy victory. With the redoubt secured, the Swedish army pressed on. So far, the invasion had gone smoothly. The weather held and the losses were minimal. Only one soldier had fallen in battle. Armfeldt had pierced Norway's outer defenses with surprising ease, leaving the Norwegian commander Budde furious. The greatest prize was the confiscated provisions at Skåne Redoubt, extending supplies by 2 weeks. On September the 5th, Armfeldt's forces marched toward Trondheim. They followed the coastal road, camping near Alstadshaug Church. The journey was simple until they reached Langstein on September the 8th, where a narrow passage squeezed between the fjord and a 200-meter cliff. The Norwegians had fortified the heights, and forcing passage would mean bloodshed. Armfeldt, aged 52, led a small force scaling the mountain. The maneuver worked. As the Swedes appeared overhead, the Norwegians fled. Then the rain began to fall. The muddy path through Langstein delayed them for 2 days. By the time they reached Sjördal, the rain showed no sign of stopping. Armfeldt hesitated. The river ahead was fordable, but rising waters soon made the crossing impossible. Attempts to build a bridge failed, and the army stalled. Supplies dwindled, and the soldiers grew weary under relentless rain. When reinforcements finally arrived, they brought only what the army had already consumed during the wait. Armfeldt was forced to withdraw north for food. Morale plummeted, and sickness spread. The relentless rain turned the campaign into a miserable trudge. The Swedes retreated to Verdal via a different route. Snow on the mountain passes choked the supply lines from Duved. Foraging parties were dispatched, instructed to pay for goods, but impoverished Norwegian farmers were unwilling to sell. As desperation grew, so did plundering. Norwegian guerrilla fighters harassed the Swedes. The Norwegians destroyed mills and tools. Farmers fled, leaving harvests to rot under the rain. By October, 1,200 soldiers had fallen ill. The redoubts became makeshift hospitals. For nearly a month, the army languished until October 28th, when the king's orders arrived. Seize Trondheim immediately. Protesting was pointless. On October the 30th, Armfeldt marched south, avoiding Langstein by taking a mountain route. The army's condition worsened as illness spread. By November the 6th, they reached Trondheim, camping 5 kilometers outside the city, exhausted and diminished. Armfeldt spent his days gathering intelligence for an attack on Trondheim. The city, shielded by a fjord, river, and the formidable Fredriksten fortress with 50 cannons, left the Swedes with a few options. Lacking siege artillery, Armfeldt's forces carried only light cannons, unable to breach the walls. A long siege was impossible. The Swedes would starve first. Storming the city became the only option, but time was slipping away. Sickness spread. Soldiers fell daily, thinning the ranks. Supply lines to Sweden were tenuous, and rations dwindled. Desperate Finnish troops boiled flour in water, devouring the paste and falling ill. Frisenheim's shipments from Duved to Sten Redoubt were unpredictable. And at the siege's outset, only 5,000 of the original force remained battle-ready. Unknown to Armfeldt, the seas ravaged Trondheim's defenders as well. Provisions dwindled. Budde remained behind the walls, aware of the Swedes' superior numbers, but unable to procure supplies as easily. Trondheim's citizens bore the burden. Buildings were seized, defenses reinforced with civilian materials, and outer destructions demolished to impede the Swedes. Overcrowded and filthy, the city reeked of suffering. On November the 8th, new orders arrived from the king. Take Trondheim immediately. Armfeldt ordered storm ladders and rafts to be prepared. Soldiers received rations and assumed battle formations. But the plan? Unclear in surviving records. Without artillery, the challenge loomed large. For 2 days, the Swedes stood poised for battle. The order never came. On November the 14th, the army packed up and marched to Melhus, camping for weeks while awaiting heavy artillery. Meanwhile, the Norwegians grew bolder. Troops disrupted Swedish foraging and intercepted mail. A small patrol led by Finnish captain Peter Långström, a feared and legendary figure in Norway, fell into an ambush. 62 farmers attacked. Mortally wounded, Långström hurled his mailbag into the river before capture. Norwegian fishermen later recovered it, handing vital intelligence to Commander Budde. While Armfeldt lingered, the southern army under the king advanced. On October the 30th, the king crossed into Norway. By early November, the siege of Fredrikshald fortress began. King Charles XII died during the siege of Fredrikshald. The next day, under Frederick of Hesse's command, the war council decided to end the siege, despite some belief it could be won in 8 days. Only Charles XII's nephew, called Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp, wanted to continue fighting. With the king's death, the motivation to persist in the war waned, and the focus shifted to Stockholm, where succession, government changes, and personal interest became paramount. During the retreat, chaos reigned as higher officers abandoned their troops, leading to a poorly managed withdrawal. Essential supplies were left behind due to a lack of transport. The retreat was marked by extreme cold, with soldiers dismantling houses for warmth, roasting animals over fires, and sleeping under the open sky. The harsh condition claimed many lives, with frozen soldiers found along the roads. Upon reaching Sweden, the situation didn't improve, with numerous deaths from cold, starvation, and disease. Rumors about the king's death circulated throughout December, but the connections between the army in the north and the rest of Sweden were poor, and there was a high risk of propaganda. Armfeldt had previously received information from De la Barre, one of his closest men stationed in Röros, that the king was certainly not dead. Everything was supposed to be fine. Thus, it's understandable that Armfeldt distrusted all information and rumors about the king's death. Despite this, he ordered the army to march towards Haltdalen, further away from Trondheim. Commander Budde had already learned on December 18th that the Swedish king had died. The Norwegians rang the church bells and fired salutes. Armfeldt could only interpret this as a war ruse, intended to lower Swedish morale. Therefore, he kept his soldiers busy with constant work, building storm ladders and other equipment for the planned assault. The idea was that occupied soldiers would be less susceptible to the circulating propaganda. Frisenheim in Duved, having received earlier orders from Frederick of Hesse to retreat, immediately began planning to quickly transport the sick soldiers from the redoubts at Stene and Skåne back to Sweden. There were about 1,000 soldiers who needed to be transported home, and the first soldiers arrived as early as 23rd of December. By the end of the month, all the soldiers were back home. The redoubts were burned down along with vast amounts of food and livestock. The area around Duved became overcrowded with soldiers, as it consisted of only a few farms. Frisenheim gave up his own bed so that other soldiers could have a place to sleep. There was also a shortage of supplies in Duved. Communication with the rest of the country was inadequate, leading Frisenheim to desperately search for more food and fodder to meet the growing need. Thanks to Frisenheim's efforts, both animals and people survived in greater numbers than would have been expected otherwise. The Swedish vanguard arrived at Haltdalen on 24th of December, with the main force following 2 days later. It was here in Haltdalen that Armfeldt, with undeniable certainty, confirmed that the king had indeed died a month earlier. He ordered a retreat, but determining the best route was challenging. Going through Röros and back to Sweden was risky. There was a significant chance of encountering a Norwegian army from the south, something Armfeldt was unwilling to risk. Another route had to be taken, Armfeldt decided that the army would take the path over Buckhammaren mountain via Tidal, a 60-kilometer march over the mountain to Swedish Handal, and another 30 kilometers from there to the base in Duved. Winter was now setting in, and the cold was spreading across the Norwegian landscape. The Swedish soldiers had inadequate winter clothing, if they had any at all. 14 soldiers had already frozen to death in the camp at Haltdalen. Armfeldt had requested better equipment early in the fall, but had received nothing in preparation for winter. On December the 29th, the army began to ascend Buckhammaren mountain. They had to cover 25 kilometers to reach the other side. Armfeldt chose to stay behind with a rear guard and to depart later. The march over the mountain worsened when a storm started, with sleet pouring down at the soldiers, making navigation difficult as the whipping rain prevented them from looking up for too long. It was bitterly cold. More and more soldiers began to lose their way. Meanwhile, Norwegian sharpshooters on skis followed the Swedes, shooting whenever they had a chance. On the mountain, many sleds with baggage were abandoned as the horses could no longer pull them. Some soldiers tried to seek shelter among large rocks, but never left. They had frozen to death. Along the entire mountain lay soldiers frozen in various positions, starved, poorly clothed, and 6 soldiers couldn't make it across. Armfeldt, following in his sled with the rear guard, must have witnessed this landscape of frozen soldiers and abandoned sleds as a vision of hell. Soldiers arrived scattered in different villages on the other side of the mountain. It took about 2 days for the army to gather in the villages of Ås and Ösby in Tidal. Here, the Swedes frantically gathered food from the local farmers, resorting to outright plundering of the Norwegian population. Soldiers huddled around large fires near farms. The Norwegian countryside was sparsely populated, so there weren't enough farms to accommodate all the soldiers. Most had to crowd around the campfires that were lit. Gangrene was now common among the soldiers. Frostbite led to tissue death. It first turned red and swollen, then itchy, and changed to the black hue of death. Soldiers helped each other to amputate limbs, cutting off fingers and toes. Armfeldt chose to send a small patrol to Duved to prepare for the army's retreat. It consisted of 14 soldiers and Captain Lars Hammarskjöld. This patrol was Sweden's first military unit on skis. On New Year's Eve, December the 31st, they set out towards Sweden. At dawn, the army started the march, one that few would survive. It was cold, a biting frost that gnawed at the skin. Early in the morning, Armfeldt set off in a sled from Ösby towards Sweden. Armfeldt was part of the vanguard initiating the approximately 60-kilometer trek over the Øyfjell, followed by the rest of the army. Throughout the day, the army began the ascent up the mountain. It had already started to get dark, the Nordic winter days being short and the nights long. Suddenly, the sky darkened further, and a snowstorm descended upon the Swedes. The wind howled fiercely, and the snow lashed the soldiers. Some described the storm and darkness as so severe that one couldn't see their hand in front of their face, let alone their comrades. It was too late to turn back for shelter. Only the rear guard managed to return to the villages that had just left. The rest of the army was left to its fate. Night was approaching. Armfeldt and the vanguard reached the northern part of the Lake Essam by evening and set up camp there for the night. The rest of the army had to settle further back on the Øyfjell. The soldiers were scattered across the mountain, chaos prevailing. The storm did not abate. An icy chill assaulted the thinly clad soldiers as they tried to sleep. They huddled together in groups, attempting to keep warm. Trying to kindle a fire proved fruitless in many cases. The wind was too strong. When the weakly shining winter sun rose on the morning of January the 2nd, the storm had not subsided. Its strength had increased. Hundreds of soldiers lay dead, frozen like statues in groups. Some had food in their hands, others had started to undress. Some stood leaning against each other. One might think they were alive until you pushed them and they fell over. Riders had frozen their saddles while the horses kept moving. Some riders had fallen from the saddles and were stuck in the snow with their heads stuck and bodies erect. The cold was merciless, and the few regiments that managed to maintain any form of discipline were met with a gruesome sight. Dead comrades, frozen through, lay or stood along the roads as silent witnesses to the horrors of the march. A veritable frozen hell. As the army began to move towards Handal, many living were left behind, including the sick and wounded. Supplies and artillery were also abandoned. Armfeldt implored the Norwegian prisoners to guide them back to Sweden. The general had seen enough of misery, death, and wanted to save the remaining force. He promised riches and their freedom if they guided their army back to Sweden. The Norwegian soldiers later managed to escape the Swedes and save themselves. When they returned, they told the Norwegian General Budde about what they had witnessed. They told of the lamentation, the screams, and the crying that had occurred among the army. People dropped dead, and eventually there were no guards left to watch over them. The main force reached the camp at Lake Essan that day, the same place the vanguard had been the day before. They weren't gathered together, and like the day before, the forces were scattered and confused. Soldiers desperately tried to start fires, breaking their rifles to use as firewood, but to no avail. The strong winds quickly extinguished the flames. Armfeldt and the vanguard had advanced further and were now approaching the Swedish border. The soldiers now had to prepare for another long, cold night. The Norwegian villagers and farmers started to loot the corpses for valuable items. They wanted to regain some of what the soldiers had earlier stolen from them. At the same time, the Norwegians celebrated the downfall of the Swedish army in the mountains and thanked God for Norway's salvation. A new morning, new misery. More soldiers had fallen asleep in the cold and did not wake again. Desperate soldiers tried to strip their dead comrades of clothes, in hopes of gaining some warmth. The number of dead was in the thousands, but the march continued. Salvation was within reach. The vanguard followed the river Enan and arrived at the Swedish farm Handal during the day. The main force remained on the mountain, struggling. They chose different routes down to Handal. One path had less snow but was windy. The other had deeper snow but avoided the wind. With each kilometer covered, more soldiers vanished into the storm and snow. The army grew smaller by the hour. Soldiers finally began arriving at the small farm at Handal. There wasn't enough room in the farmhouses for the individual soldiers, so they had to endure the cold outside with poor fires, desperately seeking warmth, waiting for something, for warmth, perhaps for food. There wasn't enough wood to build large bonfires. Eventually, one of the farm's 3 houses was torn down for firewood. The Caroleans continued to come down from the mountain in the following days, and they continued to die, not only from the cold, but also from sudden warming. The dead bodies were laid or propped against the house walls. Meanwhile, the storm had subsided, but it brought other horrors. On the mountain, one can hear the cries of the abandoned Caroleans, those who hadn't made it all the way, but were still suffering and dying a slow death. These cries were joined by the high-pitched screams from the soldiers, whose lives the field surgeons tried to save. Barrels were filled with arms, legs, hands and fingers. On January the 9th, Captain Hammarskjöld's ski patrol that was sent ahead finally arrived. 6 out of the 14 soldiers had survived. They had lost their way in the storm and aimlessly wandered around the mountains, trying to find their way down. It was a small miracle that they had survived. Armfeldt had considered them dead. The rearguard, which had turned back when the storm hit, was later able to cross the mountain in a day. They made it over relatively unscathed. Weeks after the death march, Swedish soldiers continued to come down from the mountain. Men who had defied the cold and survived. They came crawling through the snow, refusing to die. Unfortunately, the trials were not over. The soldiers, after reaching Handal, were forced to march another 30 kilometers to Duved to set up camp later. This march claimed several hundred more lives before they reached Duved. The march over the mountain was a veritable death march. No longer was there an army under Armfeldt. Up on the mountain lay thousands of Swedish soldiers dead. The light had gone from their eyes, but with the king's death and defeat in Norway, so too did the might of Sweden as a great power fade away. When the survivors arrived in Duved, Frisenheim did everything in his power to provide the Caroleans with food and clothing. He also sent sleds to Handal to bring the sick to Duved. The cavalry was dispatched almost immediately, as there was no fodder for the horses. Armfeldt ordered all regimental commanders to submit rolls of their personnel. He needed to know how many had survived. It took a long time before these were completed. However, it is not thanks to these rolls that we know how many soldiers survived. Instead, we know the number based on the rations distributed to the troops. Of the original 10,000 soldiers who began the campaign, only around 2,700 remained on the march end. 5,700 had started the march over the mountain, and 3,000 never came down from there. Of the 2,700 survivors, 700 died in the days following the march. The survivors were severely frostbitten and exhausted, with about 500 of them permanently unfit for military service. Many of these disabled soldiers lived the rest of their lives in poverty. If we distribute the losses among 10 soldiers, the following picture emerges. Survivors, 2 soldiers. Dead from the cold and frostbite, 5 soldiers. Dead from diseases and hardships, 2 soldiers. Dead in combat, 1 soldier. Armfeldt's campaign to Norway brought great suffering to both the Swedish and Norwegian armies, as well as to the civilian population in the region. Though there were few battles, the deaths were numerous. The devastation marked the rural areas for many years afterward. On the Norwegian side, traces of the catastrophe were found when people dared to venture up the mountain. Thousands of frozen bodies lay scattered in the snow. A local legend tells that the wolves in the area grew unusually large in the years following the disaster. This tragedy, known as the Caroleans' Death March, is one of the greatest military disasters in Swedish history. It was not the enemy's sword that defeated Armfeldt's army, but the relentless nature, poor leadership, and an extreme lack of preparation. The march shows human fragility in the face of nature's power. As Armfeldt's army vanished into the mountains cold, so too did the remnants of Sweden's time as a great power. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated on our latest uploads.